So we all know that the Megalodon was an absolute beast of a shark, right? But I want you to think about the fact that it's gone. This absolute unit of a predator just vanished. Meanwhile, the great white is still here, swimming around. So what the hell happened? How on earth does the Megalodon lose its crown to a fish less than a third of its size? And you might be thinking that there was some epic battle between these two predators, but that's not what happened at all. The real story is way more interesting than that. So let's go back in time and walk through this whole thing step by step. I'm talking about 20 million years ago, to a time called the Miocene epoch, where the dinosaurs have been dead for like 40 million years, and the Megalodon reigns supreme. Now, when I say that this thing was big, I need you to really understand what I'm talking about, because the largest megalodons probably hit around 60 feet long, with some estimates pushing it closer to 80 feet. For comparison, the biggest great white sharks we see today max out at around 20 feet. And just a little side note, sharks are made of cartilage instead of bone, meaning that their skeletons basically turn to mush after they die. So almost everything we know about the megalodon, or just extinct sharks in general, comes from their teeth. So I'm just putting that out there as a little FYI. Now, for about 20 million years, the megalodon ruled the oceans without any real competition. That's the kind of dominance that makes every other predator in Earth's history book look like an amateur. But while the Megalodon was busy being the ocean's king, evolution was quietly cooking up something new in the background. Because at around 6 million years ago, something interesting started happening in the Pacific Ocean. A new type of shark started to appear. It wasn't huge, maybe around 15 to 20 feet, and as you can probably guess, this was the great white shark. Well, the early version of it. Now, for a couple million years, these great whites stayed mostly in the Pacific. They weren't a threat to the Megalodon because they were smaller and more regional. But then, around 4 million years ago, the great whites started spreading like a viral infection because they showed up everywhere. They went from being a regional shark to a worldwide phenomenon. Now, for years, researchers looked at great whites and megalodons and thought they must be related, like they assumed great whites were just smaller versions that evolved from the megalodon line over time. But they couldn't have been more wrong. The meg and great white aren't even close cousins. The meg is from a lineage called ododontide, aka the megatooth sharks, while the great white is from the laminid lineage, aka the mackerel sharks, and they split paths like 60 million years ago, so they're about as related as a wolf and a seal. So that means the great white was an outsider who showed up from a different branch of the shark family tree and started sizing up the reigning champion. Now, I know I've been rambling, but stick with me because this is where the timeline gets really important. For a long time, most textbooks would tell you that the Megalodon went extinct about 2.6 million years ago. But about a decade ago, a team of researchers led by a paleontologist named Robert Bosenecker decided to take a closer look at that date. They went through the fossil records from California and Mexico, and they noticed that a lot of these teeth that were supposedly dated to around 2.6 million years ago had problems, because it turns out that some of them had shifted within the rock layers, others were poorly documented, and some were just straight up misidentified. So when they cleaned up the data and looked at only the reliable fossils that were left, they found out that the Meg most likely went extinct around 3.6 million years ago. So, what does that mean for our story? Well, if great whites didn't start appearing worldwide until around 4 million years ago, and the Meg most likely went extinct around 3.6 million years ago, that gives us an overlap of about 400,000 years where these two predators shared the oceans. Now, if we look deeper into this overlap between the Meg and the great white, we would stumble upon a guy named Jeremy McCormick. Now, remember when I said that sharks turn to mush after they die, so almost everything we know about extinct sharks comes from their teeth? Yeah, this guy knew that, so instead of just looking at the shape of the teeth like everyone had been doing for decades, he led a team of scientists that actually looked at what was inside the teeth. Specifically, they looked at zinc isotopes, and I know it sounds like something you'd fall asleep reading about in a textbook, but stick with me here.
You see, when animals eat things, the chemical makeup of their food leaves traces in their teeth that can stay there for millions of years. Different types of food leave different chemical signatures. Animals that eat high up the food chain, like sharks that eat seals and whales, have different zinc signatures than animals that eat lower down, like sharks that eat fish. What I'm trying to say is that heavier zinc isotopes are more common in plants and the animals that eat them, which means they were at the bottom of the food chain, while lighter zinc isotopes appear as you move up the food chain. So by measuring the zinc in fossil teeth, you can figure out where an animal was ranked in the lobby it was placed in. So the researchers took a dentist's drill and shaved off small pieces of enamel from fossilized shark teeth. First, they tested this method on 20 living shark species to make sure it actually worked, and it did because they could clearly see the difference between sharks that ate fish and sharks that ate marine mammals. Then, they applied the same technique to 13 extinct species, including the Megalodon. And what they found was the smoking gun, because when they looked at teeth from the early Pliocene, that's right around the time when great whites were spreading worldwide, they discovered that megalodons and great whites had identical zinc signatures. So it means these two predators were going after the same prey, hunting in the same waters, and competing for the same resources. It wasn't that the great white was eating small fish while the megalodon went after whales. No, both species were going after marine mammals that were rich in blubber. Now, if I'm being honest, a little competition wasn't enough to kill the megalodon, so you need to understand what else was happening in the world at this time. You see, while these two sharks were competing for food, the planet itself was changing dramatically. We're talking ice ages and glacier expansion, the whole 9 yards. Now, around this time, the Isthmus of Panama was forming, which connected North and South America and basically rearranged ocean currents across the entire planet. This changed where warm water went and where cold water went, and because cold water holds fewer nutrients, this affected the entire food chain. And you can add the fact that the sea levels started dropping as more and more water got locked up in the ice caps, so those warm, shallow coastal areas where megalodons like to hunt started disappearing, either by turning into land or much deeper water. And those coastal areas weren't just hunting grounds, they were nurseries, not just for the megalodons, but also for prey animals like small whales and seals. So when those habitats started to shrink, the prey populations followed right behind them. So, in simple terms, there just weren't as many snacks swimming around as there used to be, and the places that they used to reproduce and raise their young also started disappearing.
So now you've got a situation where megalodons can't really reproduce to maintain a healthy population with less food overall in the ocean, and the food that remains is being aggressively hunted by a smaller and faster competitor who can go places that the meg can't. Now you're probably scratching your head thinking, what do you mean by go places the meg can't? Well, that's another piece of the puzzle that really hurts the megalodon's case, because it has to do with something you might not think about when it comes to sharks, which is temperature tolerance. You see, great whites have this adaptation called regional endothermy, which basically means they can keep parts of their body warmer than the surrounding water. They have muscles that we call red muscles. Those are the muscles that's constantly moving, constantly generating heat, positioned toward the core of their body, which insulates them from the cold water. Even more importantly, they have a complex network of blood vessels that acts as a counter-current heat exchanger. So cool blood coming from the gills runs right alongside warm blood draining from the muscle, and heat gets transferred across the vessel walls. So by the time that cool blood reaches the muscle, it's almost as warm as the muscle itself. So this lets them swim faster, hunt in colder waters, and be more active overall. And warm muscles just performs better than cold muscles, and anyone who plays video games can attest to that. Now the megalodon had this adaptation as well, but it had a catch. You see, being warm-blooded is expensive. It takes a ton of energy to maintain that elevated body temperature. So it means that the megalodon needed an enormous amount of calories just to keep the engine running. It needed to eat constantly. And if the food supply starts to dwindle, well, that means trouble.
So when the oceans started cooling down and their habitable territory started shrinking, areas that used to be perfect megalodon habitat became too cold for them, so they had to retreat to the remaining warm spots, which meant they were crowded into smaller and smaller areas, which also means that they were probably fighting over the last bits of remaining food. Now, I don't need to explain what happens when two giants start fighting over food, do I? The great whites, on the other hand, could follow the prey into cooler waters. When the whales moved toward the poles to find food, the great whites could just follow along behind them. The megalodons were stuck in the shrinking warm zones, watching their food supplies swim away to places they physically couldn't follow. And there's actually a dark irony in all of this that I want you to appreciate, because it's one of those things that makes you think about how evolution works. Because for millions of years, being huge worked brilliantly for the megalodon. They were literally the apex of apex predators, as in if the ocean had a mafia, they would have been the godfather. But that success came with a hidden cost, because when your whole survival strategy depends on being the biggest thing in the water, you don't have a lot of backup plans. You can't just switch to eating sardines when times get tough, because when you're that large, you need massive amounts of territory, massive amounts of prey, and stable conditions. Change any of those variables even a little bit, and the whole system starts to wobble. Change them a lot, and the whole thing comes crashing down. The great white, being smaller and more flexible, had options, because it could eat marine mammals when they were available, it could eat fish when it had to, and it could follow prey into cooler waters. It could adapt. That flexibility, that ability to adapt and change and roll with the punches, turned out to be worth more than raw power when the planet started throwing curveballs at everyone. And that pretty much sums up the story of how the megalodon lost to the great white. Because with all those variables changing at once, being able to adapt is the thing that separates the survivors from the fossils. So there was no war. The great white was just better at playing the long game. And in the game of evolution, that's often what matters most. So now, here we are millions of years later, and great white sharks are still doing their thing. They're not as big or as terrifying as their prehistoric rivals, but they don't need to be. They've found what works for them, and they've stuck with it. Now, with that being said, thanks for watching.